Eagles Entertainment.
Eagle Eye in the Sky is fueled by Gatorade, the official sports drink of the Philadelphia Eagles.
Anything that move, I don't care who it is. Let's go. Give me everything you got. Play fast, play hard. Let's beat these boys tonight in their house. It's party time. It's party time. There we go. Touchdown!
You're listening to the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast. Now here's your host, Fran Duffy.
That's right, another week, and we're getting back into the trenches today as the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade, continues. I'm Fran Duffy, and as always, I think we've got a great show for you here on episode number 321. At the top of this week's show, we've got Chalk Talk, where I chat with a longtime center in the NFL, one of the better interior linemen of his era, and that's Eric Wood, previously with the Buffalo Bills. He now does color commentary for the Bills Radio Network, and we're going to jump into the offensive line position. We're going to talk about his career, how the position has changed since he was drafted, tips on how to scout the position with players coming from college to the NFL, and he also has some ties to a new Eagles coach, which we will get into as well in that conversation. We'll hit on all of that at the top of the show. Before we get going with Chalk Talk, just a few things I want to get through here. Now, first up, I want to remind you guys once again to head on over to our Apple Podcast page. Leave us a rating, leave us a comment. Keep those questions coming. You guys have done a great job all spring, really, of letting us know what you're looking for in the show. Questions about certain players, questions about plays and concepts. You've given us some ideas for some shows here in the coming months. So if you guys have anything, it could be a request for something for Ben and I to cover in our Scouting Report series, whatever it is, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a rating, leave a question in the comment section. We will keep this thing rolling. Appreciate everybody that has done that recently. Next up, I want to also give you guys a heads up on what's coming over on the Journey to the Draft podcast. Sticking with the offensive line theme, we did the interior guys last week. We're going to the offensive tackles this week. Who are the top offensive tackles in this class? We all know of the one blue chip player at the top, right? You've got Penei Sewell from Oregon up there at the top of the draft, but who are the other big names that you need to know? I suggest you make sure you go subscribe to get this week's slate of episodes. Greg Cosell, he's going to be by later this week. We've got another great guest as well. Ben Fennell will be joining me twice this week as well. So make sure you go join us over on the Journey to the Draft podcast, wherever podcasts can be found. Now, last thing before we get into Chalk Talk, the Eagles have made a couple of moves since the start of the new league year. We're a few days in, just under a week since the new league year has hit. So I wanted to comment on the Eagles' comings and goings. Obviously, the Carson Wentz trade to the Indianapolis Colts for a third-round pick this spring and a pick next year. That would be a first-round pick if he either plays 75% of the Colts snaps or 70% of the snaps, and the Colts were to make the playoffs. I refer to this as a conditional first-round pick, and there's been a lot of talk about, is it a conditional first or a conditional second? Why do I view it as a conditional first? Well, Carson has hit one of those marks every single season he's been in the league. So chances are he's going to hit it. If he happens to not do that for the Colts, then the pick would revert to a round two. But I think ultimately that's going to be a first-round pick when it's all said and done. Now, I could dive into further detail on this trade, but to be honest, there's been so much written, so much discussed about this trade, not just here on our channels, but on other channels as well. So I don't want to be repetitive. I don't want to kind of get into things that everybody else has already done. I will say this. If you have not yet, make sure you go check out last week's Eagles Insider podcast, where Dave Spadaro caught up with both Eagles head coach Nick Sirianni as well as general manager Howie Roseman to discuss the deal in an exclusive sit-down with both of those guys before their press conference, which happened last Thursday. And you can find all of that over on PhiladelphiaEagles.com, on the Eagles mobile app. You can go check out that exclusive interview with Dave over on the Eagles Insider podcast, wherever podcasts can be found. So, Carson Wentz trade, that goes through. The Eagles also made the decision to part ways with a handful of players over the course of these last couple of weeks. Malik Jackson was released. Alshon Jeffrey was released. The Eagles said goodbye to Deshaun Jackson as well. Rudy Ford, Trayvon Hester also released previously as well. Going to Malik Jackson, look, this is a guy that I have loved for a long time. I've followed Malik Jackson coming when he came out of Tennessee, goes to the Denver Broncos, was a great player there on their Super Bowl run, goes to Jacksonville, then ends up here. We only got to see one really good year of him, right? Because we just saw this past season. I thought he was really disruptive. Obviously, his versatility stands out. It's a shame that we didn't get to see a full season last year as well. But once the Eagles signed Javon Hargrave last spring, it made keeping both Malik Jackson, Hargrave, and then obviously Fletcher Cox, all three of these guys on the roster, that made that a little bit of a tough deal, right? So Malik Jackson, he moves on. He has since signed with the Cleveland Browns. You go to Alshon Jeffrey, and look, at the end of the day, Alshon Jeffrey was exactly what the Eagles needed to be when he was brought in back in the spring of 2017. They don't win the Super Bowl without Alshon Jeffrey. I remember exactly where I was sitting at the game, at Super Bowl 52. That touchdown catch happened right in front of me, and I'll never forget it. And just not just that play, but across the board, what he was able to do throughout the course of that season. The Eagles don't get the Lombardi Trophy without Alshon Jeffrey. Obviously, he's been banged up with a variety of injuries since that title win, but just an outstanding player during that run, a huge part of that. And obviously, Deshaun Jackson, I mean, there's nothing to say, one of the best receivers in franchise history. The Eagles move on from him as well. He has since signed with the LA Rams, so he goes home to Southern California. Good for Deshaun Jackson. As far as who is coming in, Adrian Killins, the previously a rookie, he's not a rookie anymore, rookie running back from Central Florida. He was re-signed. And what interests me about Adrian Killins, look, we talked about his versatility and the dynamic playmaking qualities and all the different things that he can bring to the table from an offensive skill standpoint. I'm excited to see what he could be potentially in this offense with Nick Sirianni. Remember, they had a guy in Nyheim Hines who was kind of a similar skill set in Indianapolis, right? So Adrian Killins, not the same prospect that Nyheim Hines was coming out. Hines, I believe, was a 4th-round pick when he came out of NC State. Adrian Killins was undrafted, but when you talk about a skill set standpoint, they share some similarities. So I'm excited to see what he looks like here this spring, this summer. The Eagles also re-signed defensive tackle Hassan Ridgeway. I like what Hassan Ridgeway has done and what he has put on film since he's been here in Philadelphia. Ironically enough, he was traded from the Indianapolis Colts in the 2018 NFL Draft. But this is a guy that has been disruptive. He can play either defensive tackle spot, whether it's the 1 or the 3 technique. I'm excited to see what he looks like here in this new defensive scheme. But whenever he's been on the field, whenever he's been healthy, and that's been the issue, right? He has not been healthy over the course of his career here. But when he's been on the field, he's been a nice rotational piece along the defensive front. And when you lose Malik Jackson, you'd like to have some of those guys there in the wings waiting. The Eagles moved on from Trayvon Hester, but you keep Hassan Ridgeway. You've got T.Y. McGill there kind of waiting in the wings. So we'll see if they decide to add anybody else to that position, whether it's in free agency or through the draft. Another new name here, Andrew Adams, signed from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He just won a Super Bowl ring down there with Tampa. He was a 2016 undrafted free agent out of UConn. He goes to the New York Giants. He started 13 games as a rookie. Since that point, he started a couple games here and there with the Giants. Then he goes down to Tampa. He's got one stint there, goes to Detroit, has a cup of tea with the Lions, ends up back in Tampa, and that's when he wins the Super Bowl. He's known as being more of a special teamer. And honestly, when I look at Andrew Adams, it's almost like an apples-to-apples replacement for what Rudy Ford had brought to this team over the last couple of years. And Ford has been one of the Eagles' better special teams players when he was healthy. Andrew Adams comes in and is able to fill in that exact role while also being a reserve safety. And then the big one, and this is a name that came down over the weekend, Anthony Harris, the veteran safety from the Minnesota Vikings, signed a 1-year deal with the Eagles. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a glimpse into what we're doing here over the next couple of days. Ben Fennell and I are going to cover Anthony Harris in this week's Scouting Report segment. So we're going to do a deep dive into Anthony Harris right here on the show just in a couple of days. From when you're listening, this is going to go out Monday during the day. Wednesday morning, you will have a podcast where Ben and I do a deep dive into Anthony Harris. What I will tell you before I jump into the film on him, he is known as one of the more reliable safeties in the NFL. He's been durable. He's a very good tackler. He's instinctive. He's known from the mental side of the game. He was an undrafted free agent coming out of Virginia, ironically the alma mater of one Rodney McLeod as well. And I think him and McLeod, they share a lot of similar traits in terms of their ability to play deep, come down from depth and finish as a tackler in the flat, not necessarily box players or, down playing in traffic, but when you're talking about playing in space and coming down and making tackles in space, doing all those different things, they can certainly do that. And I think with Harris, he certainly brings that skill set as well as knowledge of what new defensive coordinator Jonathan Gannon is bringing here to Philadelphia as well. They overlapped during Gannon's time in Minnesota. And a lot to cover there, obviously, but that's my plan here coming through the rest of this offseason, at least in terms of the free agency period, right? If there's a huge addition, then we'll do kind of an emergency pod and we'll do a quick podcast. But if it's, otherwise we'll just try and do a little bit of a weekly check-in. Who are the names coming in? Who are the names going out? We'll try and do that, at least on a weekly basis here on the podcast. So we've covered all that. Let's get this show started now. It's time to kick things off with Eric Wood in Chalk Talk.
Let's get down to business. It's time for Chalk Talk.
Well, pleased to welcome in a longtime NFL veteran here to the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, a longtime Buffalo Bills center, Eric Wood. Eric, thanks for joining us here on the show.
My pleasure, Fran.
So let's kind of get into this because one thing I did not share with you before we started recording, you and I have been on the same field twice, and both times it did not go well for me, for the team that I was affiliated with. Last time was 2011, and it was Eagles-Bills up there in Orchard Park. This was the game where you guys were salting away the game late, and Ryan Fitzpatrick used the hard count. Jaquay Parker jumps off sides, and you guys get the win. So that was the last time. The one before that was 5 years earlier, and I believe it was your second year as a starter in college in Louisville. You were at the Link this time. I was working for Temple football. You guys obliterated it. I mean, you had Brian Brom, you had Michael Bush had just gotten hurt the week before. I forget who you guys played week one, but you guys beat us 62-0. And I won't remember that story. I won't forget that score because we lost to Minnesota the next week, 62-0 as well. It was a rough going that year. You guys had so much talent. Harry Douglas, Mario Arrudia, that team was absolutely stocked. So I want to ask you this question. Reflecting back on your career, going back to that day, 2006, to young Eric Wood, what advice would you give to that version of yourself, just from a pure on-field standpoint as a football player? What advice would you give to yourself that day?
Maybe not ride that roller coaster of emotions as much as you did through college, through the early stages of my NFL career, and understand that those guys on the other side of the ball, they practice in the NFL, they get paid too. I was notorious for throwing my helmet on the sideline, not throwing a full-on tantrum, and I'm not a receiver, thank God, or else that would have been all over the TVs and whatnot. But for me, just realizing that one play isn't the end of the world. And I think mentally I would have been in a lot better space through it all.
How long and when did that kind of click for you to not necessarily be, in that manner?
I think later in my career, I got injured my first 4 years in the league after being a first-round draft pick to the Bills. So I wanted to give them a huge return on investment. When I got into college, I only had one scholarship offer, and that was to the University of Louisville. So same sense. I wanted to give them a great return on their one scholarship that they gave me, the only one that I had. And so I think I just put a lot of pressure on myself. And as my career progressed in the NFL, I got my second contract with the Bills, was able to stick around with the organization and just being around some veteran players. And I think, as you mature too, maybe you become a little bit more realistic about maybe expectations going into a game. And that doesn't mean I was any less competitive, but it was simply, hey, I'm not going to let one bad play turn into two here. I'm going to bounce back a lot quicker if I do have a bad play.
So before I want to talk to you a lot about offensive line play and your career, but before we get there, I brought up that 2006 Louisville team, and one guy that you were on that team with was current Eagles defensive coordinator Jonathan Gannon, who was a former player who ended up being a student assistant, and he ended up staying with Bobby Petrino. Give us, do you have any kind of insight into what he was like at that point in his career?
Yeah, he was an absolute incredible athlete. The problem was he kept getting injured, and then he had a career-ending hip injury early in college. But he was so cerebral, so smart, so mature at such a young age that Bobby was willing to bring him onto the staff. So, he came in a few recruiting classes ahead of me, and then he was coaching us, so just not far removed. But he just had that sense about him that you knew he was going to be a superstar in whatever John wanted to get into. He's just got that type of personality. He's a gravitating personality. Wait till you see these guys trailing him around like a puppy dog at training camp. When guys get around John Gannon, they gravitate towards him. He's a leader of men, and then he's super smart about ball. He's coached a bunch of different positions. He's been around, and I'm excited for him to have this opportunity. I texted him and said, how proud I was of him. And then I sent him a picture of me from the golf course and said, too bad you're not doing this, but I'll root super hard for him. And with my affiliation with the Bills, it's always easy to root for the NFC teams.
That's right. The feeling is certainly mutual for sure. All right, let's get into a little bit of your playing career, and I want to talk to you about offensive line play. One thing I love asking people, at the positions that they kind of specialize in, is there a part of the position that you feel is just not really talked about enough, but you as a player or as a coach, you look at it and you're like, this is really, really important. Media and fans don't necessarily talk about it often. What would that be for you when it comes to offensive line play?
Let me start off and give you the opposite. What's probably talked about too much, and that would be size. size, strength, speed. You need certain thresholds to play the position in the NFL, but the best offensive lines in the NFL year after year are not your 6'4" to 6'8", 350-pound average guys. Now, some of those guys are absolute elite offensive linemen in the NFL, but people get so enamored with the tangibles, and with offensive line play, so much of his intangible. You think about a Jason Kelce, who's been so effective throughout his career. He's a former linebacker, so yes, he's got great athleticism, but size, strength-wise in the weight room, no, he's not going to be your biggest, strongest dude, but he's led your offensive line for almost a decade. For a decade, he's led the offensive line for the Eagles and playing at an extremely high clip throughout his career. And so you get a guy like Jason, who is smart and tough, and it kind of has one of the three. He's got the athleticism. Well, now you can ride with a guy like that. But what I think doesn't get talked about enough would be how smart an offensive lineman is. And it's sometimes tough to quantify, because I'm not talking about taking an IQ test. I'm not talking about Wonderlic scores. I'm talking about football smarts. How quick can you make decisions on the field? How quick are you able to read defenses when people are moving at the last second? They're doing something that we hadn't seen watching film throughout the week. How quick can you adjust? Because at times it doesn't matter how big and strong and fast you are, and even how good at blocking you are, if you don't know exactly where you need to be, if you can communicate with the rest of the offensive line. And as I've talked to GMs, throughout my career and then even post, a lot of GMs in the NFL, the prerequisites are that they're smart and tough.
Yep.
Beyond that, okay, now let's see what else we're working with. And that kind of determines if it's a top 5 pick, a first rounder, a mid-round guy, whatever it may be. But you got to have the smarts and the toughness.
I don't want you to say any names or anything, obviously, but were there ever points in your career when you would talk to a young guy when he first got in, maybe he was a high pick, maybe he was a mid-round pick, and he was going to be counted on, you thought early on to kind of be a contributor, and you talk to him and you're just like, right off the bat, the guy doesn't have it? Or is that something from a football intelligence standpoint where all right, he's not there yet, but I do think he can get there?
A couple of examples would be, you get a guy that plays in an offense like the old Brile system at Baylor.
Yeah.
Well, it's so hard for those guys to transition to the NFL because they haven't had to communicate. They haven't had a bunch of assignments. They never have their hand in the dirt. And then you have the opposite. And you have a guy, and I'll use a Philadelphia guy, a Deion Dawkins, who comes into the NFL, starts as a rookie at left tackle. He's 6'3". He'll tell you he's 6'4", 6'5".
That's
6'3". Right. And I'm really good friends with Deion, and so I can say these things about him. And he knows how much I love him. So,
yep.
But Deion's 6'3", and now he's athletic, but he's smart and he's tough. And I don't know what Deion got on his Wonderlic, and I don't care. But you get a guy like him who's willing, and no, when he came in, he relied on Richie Incognito playing next to him to help him out with some assignments and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But Deion was so tough, and he came from a school in Temple where you play with your hand in the ground. You run the ball and you pass block. So those types of guys, and that's where when you're drafting guys, you have your talent evaluators, and they generally do a good job of being able to figure out who can come from an offense, maybe like a Baylor, an Oklahoma. Someone's going to pass the ball, a lot throughout their college career. Okay, they will be able to translate. They do these things well. But for me, it's easier to see a guy like a Deion Dawkins who already did both in college, and then he translates so well early in his career to the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at that point, if it's an offense that doesn't project well, then you're really going to have to lean on, those personal exposures, those conversations, say the Orlando Brown, a good example, like Orlando Brown's at Oklahoma. It's, what the kind of offense you're talking about. Then he goes to Baltimore, and, I don't know that he's taking a natural pass set at all with Oklahoma or with Baltimore. So it all comes down to, do you have that mental capacity to be able to make that transition?
Yeah, that's a great point, and he's a perfect example. And there's so many guys. And I said Oklahoma, they do run the ball probably more than a lot of people give them credit for. They just had all those top-tier Heisman caliber quarterbacks, so you think of them airing it out all the time. But nowadays it's hard on these talent evaluators to get guys in college and be able to project them out into the NFL. You've seen a number of misses, and a lot of those misses, going back to my original point about the size and the speed in the strength necessarily doesn't always translate to the NFL. That's where you see a lot of these guys miss, because you get enamored with this specimen. But besides, Tyron Smith, who, I was at the Pro Bowl with and got to see him hanging out in the pool, and he doesn't look like the rest of the O-linemen. Most of us kind of look alike. We're not these Greek god looking offensive linemen, but you see a lot of the elites. You see the Zach Martins, the Quentin Nelsons, and they are so tough and smart.
Is there a difference when you're looking at what is needed mentally at the center position versus guard versus tackle? Can you get away with a little bit more playing out in the perimeter versus playing at the pivot?
Yeah, you can. And certain guys have certain skill sets that maybe your role is going to be able to help out the guy next to you. But if you have a center, unless you have a Peyton Manning that is truly at the line of scrimmage directing everybody, and I'm not trying to discredit Jeff Saturday. He was still doing a lot of the organizational stuff at the line of scrimmage. But the center position in the NFL is generally going to need to be a great communicator, and he's going to have to be fairly smart, because he's going to have to be able to get everybody on the same page and be confident enough in his call that, man, I got to be right here, but we're all at least going to be on the same page. And so, yes, the center position, I would say, would require some more intelligence, unless you had two really smart guards that could kind of pick up the slack for him.
Was there a point for you where you felt, all right, like I've made that next step mentally, in terms of whether it's confidence or just play recognition, seeing what the defense is throwing at you? At what point did that happen for you in your career?
Yeah, early in my career, I played with Ryan Fitzpatrick, and he ran a lot of the show up front. It wasn't me switching protection at the line of scrimmage. That was always Fitz. He wanted to be able to dictate the protection to give him the proper throwing lanes, whatever it may be. So he did all that. So there wasn't a ton of pressure on me early in my career to other than get us all kind of on the same page up front after Fitz gave us the direction. Well, you move into, we went to EJ Manuel. Well, now I'm older than him. I'm going to help out the quarterback. And that kind of became a theme throughout the rest of my career, that I was trying to take some off the quarterback's plate. That made me more valuable to the organization. It gave me a great role within the offense. So, I'd say probably year 4-ish, I was kind of taking over a lot of that stuff. Could I have done it sooner? Likely. But it was a nice transition that I didn't have to do that early on.
Is there an athletic trait that you feel, we talked earlier about, look, the smarts and toughness, but when you look at the physical aspect of it, is there one that you feel is most important over the others, where you're like, all right, this one tends to lead to more success in the NFL?
Yeah, and I would say as long as you have a certain threshold of strength, then you'll be fine in the NFL. I've played with guys that can barely bench 315 pounds and have a really long career. And for those listening out there, I don't mean to demean your bench performances. And for all you meatheads out there, don't think you're stronger than all the offensive linemen in the NFL. But I've played with guys that could barely bench 315 pounds, but they were quick enough. And then you have enough natural size that you're not going to be easily moved. I think ultimately there takes a certain amount of athleticism to be an elite offensive lineman. There's guys that can, get away with not being a very good athlete. But then when you look at those true athletes, and, from a Philadelphia perspective, gosh, you guys are littered with guys, but, your Lane Johnson, your Jason Peters, your Jason Kelsey, Brooks. I mean, so many big athletes, and that's how you build an elite offensive line, because those guys are quick enough that they can do things in space that a lot of guys can't.
So, like, for me, and I'm always, I love evaluating college players and trying to project them to the next level, and kind of self-scouting myself. The one position I feel like I have a lot of variance on, I'm going to have misses everywhere. Interior O-line is an area where I feel like I'm not as good as I would like to be at this point. So I would love to get some tips from you in terms of, hey, if you're watching guys in college, whether it's guard or center, here are some things there where this is kind of, all right, this is a worrisome trait or something worrisome on film, or like, hey, if he's got this, then we're cooking with gas.
Man, that's a tough one, because you get guys like Cody Ford for the Bills now, who played tackle in college,
right,
and now they're looking at him more as a guard. And you're seeing that more and more, where, like I mentioned, you sometimes in college, you'll put your better athletes at tackle. Well, now in the NFL, we want all athletes. So maybe we move them inside. If you're looking at interior offensive linemen, especially centers that can't move a whole lot, nowadays, a lot of centers, they want them to be able to pull. There's a lot of wide zone being run in the NFL where they have to move laterally fast. And so you want to see a good amount of quickness. If you see a plodding center in college, unless he's got just maybe elite strength that overcomes that, or body position bend, a lot of times I want to see a center with some athleticism. Your guards in college can get away with being smaller, and I don't want to sound like I'm contradicting myself saying that the size and the speed and strength, don't matter as much. But if you have that strength, or you have the toughness and you have the smarts, well, now, what else are we bringing to the table? And sometimes guards coming out of college will be a little too small. I liked my guards at least 315, 320 pounds, because they're starting a half yard behind me already. If they're getting blown backwards, it's hard for me to get on the same level as those guys in our pass protection. And so I get worried about these guards from college that want to still play guard, and you get in the wrong system, and they're going to have you lined up against a Fletcher Cox that can either go through you or around you. Well, you better be big enough that you can simply mirror him, and if he runs down the middle of you, you can absorb him. I remember later in my career playing it with Richie Incognito next to me and just being like, that is what a guard looks like. But he had so much, he was big enough to be able to withstand those guys trying to go right through him.
Yeah, to me, like the strength versus power deal in terms of being able to hold your ground versus a bull rusher or moving guys off the point of attack. I could talk to one offensive line coach or a former player or a strength coach, and they'll say, I'd rather have the guy that can hold his ground versus someone who can move people. And then I'll talk to three other people and they'll say the opposite. I go back and forth on it. Is there kind of an area where you feel more comfortable? I'd rather have the power guy, or I'd rather have the strength.
Man, I want a guy that's not going to get blown up in my quarterback's face. The NFL is becoming a passing league. Let's be honest. And so I want guys that can hold their ground up front. And a lot of that can be done with technique. That's not simply a size and strength deal. A lot of that's technique. And what makes it even tougher, to your point, Fran, to evaluate these college offensive linemen, sometimes they haven't been given the right technique. So you're seeing a guy get blown up, but maybe if I'm an elite offensive line coach in the NFL, I'm saying I can just give him these techniques, and now I know he can do it. Okay, is he willing to learn? Is he tough? Does he have everything else we want? Okay, I can help him to do that. I think there's also times where you get a little bit of arrogance from these offensive line coaches, and I say that they're the best of the best of what they do in the world, but there's got to be a certain amount of arrogance to get you to that level.
Sure.
But then they think they can take anybody and turn them into what they want to see on the field. So it does just make it a lot harder to evaluate these guys when maybe they don't have the same techniques that you're going to be teaching them at the next level. And that's where, offensive linemen, a lot of times you're relying on what you're hearing from their college coaches. What type of workers this guy, is he a film study guy? What's he like off the field? Because ultimately as well, and this is another thing you got to consider about offensive linemen, he's got to mesh with four other guys, 5 on the offensive line, and you're working in cohesion. So you have to have a guy that the rest of the line is at least going to respect. They don't have to be best friends off the field, but you want your offensive line to gel, and in the Bills a couple of years ago, I hate to keep using the Bills as an example,
sure,
but
no,
I cover them for a living. So, but 2 years ago, they bring in 6 free agent offensive linemen. But they brought in all guys with prior starting experience that were all super intelligent. Well, then they meshed really well together because they all gave a crap about each other and they all respected each other. They were veteran guys. And so they worked really well in gelling together. And that's another thing where, you get a guy from college, you got to make sure he's going to fit your room. Deion Dawkins came into our room as a rookie. And I always tell the story, I saw from him on social media was he was a little goofy and he had this Odell Beckham haircut. And I thought, oh boy, what did we get ourselves into? It only took one day for me being on the field with Deion Dawkins for me to like that dude. And so I knew that, the Bills did their due diligence on him.
Is that how it typically was with guys where you knew very early, like, all right, this guy either he's got it or he doesn't?
Generally. And you hate to say that, but you can generally tell early on when they come in, you see how they work. You see how they handle their attention to their craft, like how serious do they take each and every day the technique work. You can generally see that. And I would imagine it's the same thing coming from college. I always used to say, people would draft a player in general and expect them to either change for the good or the bad. I'm like, money amplifies who you are as a person. And so if you're a great person, you're probably going to be generous. You're probably going to end up going for a Walter Payton Man of the Year one year. But if you're not, if you're a bad person, if you're immature, money is just going to accentuate that and highlight that.
The last part I wanted to hit on here with you is just the evolution of the guys that you would line up against, because I feel like when you first got into the league, late 2000s to now, the shapes and sizes of these guys has changed so much, right? I mean, you're seeing so many more defensive ends, kick inside and sub. When did that kind of change for you? Was there a player or two that you kind of feel like paved the way for that? And who were the toughest guys for you to kind of match up from that standpoint?
Yeah, to your point, exactly, Fran. When I entered the AFC East, it was Vince Wilfork at nose in a 3-4 scheme for New England. It was Chris Jenkins in the same scheme at nose for the Jets, and Paul Solei for the Dolphins. Just three massive dudes. And they're all, I don't know what they're listed at, north of 350.
No doubt.
If they ate breakfast that day. So yeah, that's what I came in. And then there were guys that fit kind of today's mold. At the time, they were just less common. Your Jay Ratliffs down in Dallas at the time, who I know Eagles fans would be familiar with. And so I don't know exactly when it shifted. Schwartz, who came through Philadelphia, came through Buffalo as well. He was playing with some more undersized D tackles that were blown and going up the field. And, it's a copycat league. Once you see success from other teams and you're like, oh, if the nose can blow up the field super fast, well, that's going to actually make more of an impact than the guy that can just hold a guy in place, whatever it may be. And so eventually throughout my career, there was a definite shift. And, I remember playing the Eagles late in my career, and you go against Timmy Jernigan and Fletcher Cox. I mean, those are two athletes that you're playing at defensive tackle, as opposed to early in my career when generally, at least on first and second down, you were getting a dude that was a space stuffer in the middle.
And then, I mean, did it make it tougher too, just from a game prep week where it's like, all right, like not only do I have to make sure I'm watching Fletcher Cox and Timmy Jernigan, but all right, on third down, like they're going to kick Brandon Graham inside, and I got to know what his go-tos are and how he's going to try and attack me. Did that just add a different layer in terms of game prep?
Oh, definitely. And nowadays, everybody's gotten so exotic on third downs. I remember early in my career, it was very few teams that would get really exotic on third downs. You had some double-A guy blitz packages. That was generally like Mike Zimmer in that tree. And beyond that, you would get those 3-4 defenses that would bring 4 to a side, but it wasn't super exotic like it is now. But, teams have, and I don't know who I want to give exact credit for. Bill Belichick did a lot of it, moving guys around and putting a defensive end over the nose or at nose so that the center had something completely new to work with. When you watch film, you can often tell who the defensive coordinator thinks is the weakest link on the offensive line, because that's where you're putting your Fletcher Cox. Right. And so now that they have to dictate more eyes to that position because, okay, now we can't leave this position one-on-one against Fletcher Cox. Okay, so now someone's got to help him out. Do you bring pressure away from that? Do you put Brandon Graham and somebody else on the other side of it, knowing that they're now going to get one-on-ones? It's an interesting chess match. And honestly, my favorite part of football is that chess match. And I liked it when I was playing, and I still like it to this day, just figuring out within the game those little mismatches and those matchups that either the defensive coordinator is trying to exploit, the offensive coordinator, whatever it may be.
Who was the toughest coordinator go against?
Ooh, that's a great question. Early in my career, Rex Ryan had a lot of talent on that New York Jets defense, and they were really tough to prepare for because they would get really exotic. As I got older, I think Todd Bowles was always excellent. He did a great job of giving you something each week that you just hadn't seen on film. And then, I hate to admit it, but Bill Belichick was, played them twice a year. So you get used to seeing them over and over. But Bill Belichick, from a schematic standpoint, is excellent. The way he maximizes talent, the thing I think that Bill Belichick does best is he picks up guys and lets them do what they do best. He never picks up he'll never try and get Vince Wilfork to do something that a smaller 3 technique D tackle has to do, and vice versa. You're playing to your strengths at all times, and he will work your strengths into his scheme. And now they may pick guys up in free agency or draft that fit their scheme, but I've watched them pick up veterans over the years and just let them do what they do. And honestly, it goes without saying they've had sustained defensive success in New England.
Yeah, and it kind of plays to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the D ends kicking inside. Like, you would think, like, oh, well, if Vince Wilfork is just going to do this the whole time, if Kyle Van Noy is just going to be this on third down and this on first and second down, oh, that's easy to prepare for. But you're prepared. They play everybody defensively. So if they're playing, 18 guys in the front 7, that's not easy to prepare for, just from a mental standpoint. But that's a whole other podcast for sure. Eric, this has been awesome, man. I really appreciate you joining us here on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll talk to you soon, man.
All right. I appreciate that. And for all those listening out there, I know you're probably sick of hearing my Bills takes through this, but my podcast does not take I don't have a lot of Bills takes on there. It's called What's Next with Eric Wood. It's interviews that I do that look to impact and inspire those out there. So if you enjoyed our discussion here, head over to What's Next with Eric Wood and give me a shout.
I wasn't going to tell you because I already subscribed before the show started, but dude, it's a lot of fun. I love everything that I've seen so far come across the feed. But Eric, keep it up, man. Thanks so much again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Fran.
Well, great stuff there from Eric, who you can follow on Twitter just like I do at ewood70. And while you're at it, I'm at EaglesXOs. That's where I post all the podcasts I'm a part of and all of our X's and O's content that we produce here with Eagles Entertainment. You know how much I appreciate everybody that promotes this podcast on all forms of social media. That's one way to support the show, but the best way is to go on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, leave us a rating and leave us a comment. I wanted to give a shout out today to someone who did exactly that, and that's Right Him, who left a 5-star review, longtime listener, who said, "Hey, Fran, out of the hundreds of episodes you've done, the interview with Brian Billick was easily one of my top 3. I couldn't stop re-listening to it that day because of all the information I had to go back and listen to just to make sure I got it. I appreciate every episode you do. Always top-level content. That being said, I wanted to ask, one of your favorite phrases, talent sets the floor, character sets the ceiling, is, I believe, how it goes. And you are right about that. Well, it is, and that's a Bill Belichick saying, is talent sets the floor, character sets the ceiling. A follow-up to that, and this is Wilt's question, would you say from a team-building aspect, would the scheme set the floor and the amount of talented players set the ceiling? I thought about this in your discussion with Ben, talking about Travis Kelce and how much of his production came from making things easier for him and then letting his talent step out of the scheme when the play was broken and beaten. Well, I got to tell you, this question is right in my wheelhouse. I love these kinds of conversations, and it's one of the things I love most about the sport of football is that there are so many layers to everything. There's so much nuance that's needed because every situation is different from the next, right? And I think, we've talked about this is, a lot of when you talk about players and, how productive they can be, so much of it is situation based. And I wouldn't even say scheme based. I'm trying to get out of saying that it's scheme based. It is situation based. It is who are the other players that are in that depth chart, in that meeting room with them? Who are the other guys on an offense or on a defense with a player? Who are the assistant coaches? How are they coached from a technique standpoint? And then also the scheme. You get into all that as well. So it is so situation based. It's such an important part of watching players develop and trying to analyze exactly what it is that makes them so productive, that makes them such effective players. And I think you bring up a great point. Looking back at Travis Kelce, he is certainly a player. And we talked about that a couple weeks ago. I don't need to dive too deep into that, but he is a great talent in a great scheme. And what have we said almost on a weekly basis in those scouting report segments? When you have a great scheme and you marry that with great talent, you're going to get consistently great effectiveness, consistently great production. One example that I think it's so important. You look at the Green Bay Packers, a team that has been in the NFC title each of the past 2 years. They've been a couple of the best offensive teams in football since Matt LaFleur has taken over. Aaron Rodgers, Aaron Jones, Devontae Adams, right? 3 key players, 3 players that people would say are the best at their position in the NFL. Aaron Rodgers, one of the 1 or 2 best quarterbacks in the league. Devontae Adams, certainly one of the top 5 receivers. Aaron Jones quickly has become one of the best running backs. You look at David Bakhtiari, right? One of the best left tackles. You go down the line. They've got some of the best offensive personnel. But then when you look at their offense just a couple of years ago, in a different situation, different scheme, different coaching staff, those guys were not churning out the same level of production, right? So the players didn't change, but the situation changed, right? And so looking at that, I think that it's such an important part. And getting now to your question, talent sets the floor, character sets the ceiling, but then transitioning to scheme sets the floor and talented players set the ceiling. And I think it's so interesting because you look at some of these coaches, right, around the league, look at some of these schemes, and I think a good one is, we talked about Matt LaFleur, the Shanahan tree, right? So you talk about Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay. They do a great job of getting receivers open, of finding space for receivers. So, and this is just an example of the kind of things that go through my head on a yearly basis, on a monthly, daily basis, weekly basis, all the time. When you're looking at the kinds of receivers that they get, since you do such a great job schematically of creating space for these players, would it make sense that you don't necessarily need them to be great route runners, to create their own separation? We're going to get you open. I don't need you to get open. Be a great yards after catch weapon. Be a dynamic player with the ball in your hands. And I think you've seen that transition kind of happen in San Francisco, right? Look at some of the receivers that they have taken over the last couple of years. 2 of the best yards after catch weapons in each of those drafts. They took Brandon Ayuk last year. They took Deebo Samuel the year before. Neither of those guys are going to be mistaken for crafty route runners. They were not Jerry Jeudy or Justin Jefferson last year. They're not those players, right? But then you go into, and you look, what do they do? Well, they're explosive with the ball in their hands. They're tough to get down. They've got nose for the end zone, right? And then I just look at how some of those other teams from that same tree, from that same system, look at who are the kinds of receivers that they tend to bring in. And I look at like the LA Rams. They went and they go get Van Jefferson in the second round last year, right? Well, Van Jefferson was a technician. Pure technician. He was not, I know he tested pretty well, but watching him on film, not like the prettiest in terms of like height, weight, speed. Like he had height, but he wasn't the most explosive guy in the open field, not a dynamic player yards after catch wise. So it's interesting when you kind of look at that scheme and say, okay, well, what are the kinds of players that you should be trying to get to marry that scheme? These are the kinds of things that go into my head all the time. And so this is a long-winded way of me saying, I do agree with you. I think that the scheme sets the floor, and if you can get the right talent to fit that, well, now that's where you can take it to the next level. But there are so many other layers to it. I can't just take that one sentence and say, yep, this is it. This is gospel, because there are so many things that go into it as well. But I will tell you, Will, these are the kind of conversations, and I think I said this on a recent podcast. Ben, who he and I talk every single day remotely, whether it's FaceTime or going on the podcast, whatever it is, and while we're watching film and just talking together, he has got to be sick of me talking his ear off about these exact kind of questions. I always thinking about the game in this way, and I think it's what makes it my favorite sport to study. And looking at just that one little aspect of it, receivers in that kind of scheme. You can go down the line and say all the different positions, all the different, corner, you can talk safety, linebacker, tight end, offensive line. All of them have these different layers built in. All of them have all these little caveats built in. Well, how can you get even more out of this player? Or what does this kind of player need? If you're going to run a scheme this way, well, does that mean you necessarily need to value things like that? You can go back to, it was one of the first podcasts I did here on the Eagle Eye in the Sky. It was one of the first off-season interviews I remember I did with Tony Dungy. And he said that was the first thing we did when I got to Indianapolis was sat down with Bill Polian and we talked about, okay, here are the positions that are most valuable in our scheme for the Tampa 2. All right. We need front 4 because I'm not going to blitz a lot. But I will tell you this, I need corners that can tackle, so they don't need to be the fastest. I don't need you to take a corner in the first round. I don't need you to take a corner in the second round. Give me a corner that's a instinctive player, good tackler, doesn't need to run well because he's always going to have a safety over the top, and we can win. Linebackers, I need them to be sideline to sideline guys. You can get a guy that's small, that's 225 pounds, 230 pounds, and we'll make do. So what do? They go spend late round picks on Cato June and guys like that. They don't necessarily need to spend the high picks on these players. And again, it's just trying to marry personnel, the team building aspect of it with the philosophy, the coaching philosophy, and how they want to build their offense, defense, and special teams. I love these kinds of conversations, and I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit. I'm hoping that my passion comes through and how excited I get talking about these things. But Wilt, it was a great question. Thanks so much for leaving that review. Everybody, if you can, jump on to Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating, leave us a comment, leave us a question, and we'll hit on it here on the show. Thanks so much to Wilt and all of you out there for your continued support of this show and all the rest of our podcasts here with Eagles Entertainment. That being said, I think that'll do it. Another show in the books here on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade. For everybody here at the Duffy House, I am Fran Duffy. We will talk to you later this week.